There's a lot of things that I can do in my life. And I began researching the science of habits, how habits work. And what I learned is that we're actually living through this golden age of understanding the neurology of habit formation. And I ended up writing this book out of it. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I learned and what it has to do with teaching kids and mindfulness. But in order to do that, first of all, I have to tell you a story about a rat. Anyone here ever experiment with rats before? Anyone ever ride the subway? Okay, then you've done a lot of experience with rats. There's a woman named Dr. Anne Graybill who has for years been doing experiments with rats. She's a neurologist, and for years she was trying to get sensors into rats' cranium so she could measure what was going on inside their skulls. This took a long time and a lot of rats. But eventually she got to a point where she could get about 150 sensors inside a rat's skull, and she could measure its neurological activity. What she'd do with each rat after it woke up from the surgery was the exact same thing. She would drop it in the world's simplest maze. Works the same way every single time. Click, a partition would move, the rat's free to run through the maze and find the chocolate. Every rat, when you drop it in the maze the first time, acts like the world's laziest animal. It'll wander up and down, it'll get to the end, it'll see the chocolate, it'll go the other direction. It takes on average about 13 minutes for it to find the chocolate. And for years, people thought that this is because rats are unusually dumb, and that if a rat can learn something, then any animal could learn it. But Dr. Graybill could actually see inside the rat's head, and what she saw was kind of fascinating. This is a simplified neurological graph the first time a rat's dropped in this maze. There's all these spikes in activity, right? Basically, the rat would scratch the walls and the scratching centers of its brain would light up, or it'd find the chocolate and the pleasure centers would light up. This is what unmediated learning looks like. So Dr. Graybill takes this rat, she drops each of them in the maze again and again, 150 times each. Over time, unsurprisingly, the rat learns how to run through the maze faster and faster and faster, find the chocolate. But what's really interesting is what happens inside its head. As the rat learns to run faster and faster, as finding the chocolate becomes more of an automatic habit, the rat starts thinking less and less and less. This graph on the bottom is a simplified neurological graph of the 150th iteration through that maze. What you'll notice is this deep valley there, right? That's the same valley you would see if the rat went to sleep. Now, all of us have habits, right? There's a researcher named Wendy Wood who followed around a couple thousand people to see how much of our daily behaviors are habits. And what she found is about 40 to 45% of the decisions we make actually every day aren't actually decisions, they're habits. And if somehow I could get 150 sensors into your head, this is exactly what I would see. Your mental activity dropping off in the middle of that habit. When you remember waking up in the morning and walking in the subway and now you're at your desk, but you don't remember what happened in the middle. Or when you decided that morning to have a salad, but you get to lunch and you order a hamburger just like you did yesterday. This is what's happening. Your brain is kind of turning off. With these two interesting exceptions. At the beginning of the habit, when the rat would hear the click, there'd be this burst of activity. And then essentially the brain would power down. And then at the end, when it found the chocolate, it's as if the rat would sort of shake itself awake again and notice what was going on. Within neurology, this is such an important idea and finding that it's become known as the habit loop. And what it says is that every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like an automatic trigger for a behavior to start. And then a routine, which is the behavior itself. And then finally, a reward that helps your brain remember that pattern for the future. Every habit has cues and rewards. And for years, everyone from Aristotle to Oprah, when they've talked about habits, they've focused on the routine, on the behavior. But what we've learned in the last decade is that it's the cue and the reward that influence how habits function.
We put this together and we get the so-called habit loop. A cue triggers a behavior carried out, rewarded in the end, dopamine released. Because of that reward and dopamine, we do it again the next time the cue comes around. That's the habit loop, and we go through this many, many times, and we have many habits. And in the background, all our habits run through this loop over and over again. So let me give you a real-life example. Make it a little more descriptive and lively. An example from my life. When I got asked to give this talk, I was at the same time writing my master thesis, then I was researching in Harvard, and I was working part-time for a startup company. I was juggling with a lot of tasks, and I had to be really productive when I was working. There were so many distractions out there, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. So what I needed was a behavior of working focused. Now I needed a cue. I found an app on my phone called the Forest app. You plant a little seed on this app, and when you don't check your phone for a set amount of time, you plant a tree on your phone. So my cue would be, put my phone on flight mode and work focused. Plant a little tree. Now in the end, I would actually grow a whole forest at the end of the day. I would have 7, 8, 10 trees. I called the whole thing my new deep work habit, and it worked perfectly. Well, I'm standing here, and I hope I'm doing a fairly all right job. Okay, so by going through this habit so many times for several weeks, I was actually changing certain mechanisms and structures in my brain. And to make this talk a little more scientific, I think we should actually look at the human brain. Now, this is the human brain. And you can see it's fairly complex. And if I was going to tell you that about here there is some change occurring when you're doing something over and over again, it probably wouldn't really help. So what I did was I simplified the whole thing just a little bit, and I drew a sketch of my brain. Now that's my brain. I think it's fairly simple now. And after going through the deep work habit, let's say for 1 or 2 weeks, this is what you would see. You would see a network of neurons that start being connected together. And you can see that they are connected by pretty weak connections at the beginning. Now, after several weeks of me repeating this behavior over and over again, you would see that the connections are slowly getting thicker and stronger. Now, after 4, 5, 6 weeks of me repeating this behavior, 7, 8, 10 times every single day, this would happen. The connections would even get stronger. There would be a layer of fat wrapped around it, which is called myelin. Now, you might wonder, what does that mean? How does that help me? Why does my brain do this? Well, you need to understand, our brains are energy consumers. They eat energy. The human brain weighs 2% of our body weight, but it consumes 20% of our whole energy supply. And to make this consumption as efficient as possible, our brain makes very important behaviors cost very little energy, meaning the thicker the connections between neurons, the less energy is needed to perform a behavior and to activate the neurons. In this case, my brain has realized that my deep work habit was really important. It needed to be repeated so many times, meaning we shouldn't invest a lot of energy to go through the behavior. Now let's go back to the real human brain. It has almost 100 billion neurons. They are connected by tens of trillions of connections. It's vastly complex. But despite this complexity, the simple principle I just described to you still applies. Whatever your daily behaviors are, whatever you repeat over and over again, that's what the brain decides is important. Repetition is what the brain decides is important. And that's crucial. So let me be very clear here. It doesn't matter if it's something that's good for you, like exercising, or whether it's something that's bad for you, like smoking, or whether it's something that's just needed, like driving a car. Whenever there's a lot of repetition and dopamine released in the brain decides, oh, this is pretty important, we will need this.
So we're motivated to act by our basic impulses, by our emotions, by our appetites. But at a certain point, these sources of action and the acts that ensue after these things produce those actions lead to a certain type of habit, and then that habit within the person develops into what we call as a second nature. It becomes a second nature, and that second nature is referred to in English as a disposition. Now, disposition can be either good or bad. So that disposition or that nature that I have developed is a nature which inclines me towards good, and if it does so, we call it virtue. Or if it's a disposition that inclines me towards evil, we call it a vice. And so what happens after time is that once I develop this disposition, this virtue or this vice, then the thing that motivates me to act no more is simply the emotion and the appetite that I originally had, but the actual disposition is what motivates me to act. But then another power we have is the intellectual power, the intellectual appetite. And so when we do act, when we do things, when we perform actions, then eventually they develop into dispositions because the motivations towards those actions are eventually stamped upon or sort of connected with the acts to the extent that once we've done them over and over and over, that what happens is that we develop what we call either vice or virtue. So for instance, if I am become sort of ordered towards things that are harmful to myself and others, then we call that a vice. And if I become ordered towards things that are beneficial or good, we call those things a virtue. That's where we get the word, the statement of, this sort of wisdom of patience is a virtue, so not the act itself, but it's a state, maybe temperance is a virtue. So acts and emotions are connected. Emotions are appetites, or the origin of our acts. And then once we act on a regular basis, the emotions, they become attached to those actions to the extent that when that develop into dispositions, or what we call a second nature, and to the extent that then we start to act not based upon the emotions or appetite, but based upon these particular natures that we develop, and we call those natures either vice or virtue. And you can say the same thing about addiction in general. This is a problem with addiction in general, is that when people say, well, why do you use drugs? Right, why do people use crack? Why do they use cocaine? Why do they use methamphetamines? Why do they utilize, whatever, everything that's out there, that on one level is a choice, but on another level is not a choice. Why? Because it's developed into a vice. It's something that is hard to overcome. It's something that their mind tells them that, that the only way I can feel good is to have this particular thing. Even I might even want to stop, but it's hard to stop. Why? Because every time I get hungry in that area, it is directed towards this particular object or this particular item, we would say. And this is how we can explain things like addiction, for instance. If we think about vices, and some people become addicted to drugs, or they become alcoholics, among other things, and it's not just simply a choice. Some people think, well, they're just choosing to drink. I'm choosing to do drugs. Once it becomes an addiction, you're not simply choosing. You're oriented towards this particular thing, even though it's destructive. It's hard for you to overcome it. And so that being the case, with regard to these things, we need to rethink about these other aspects of the what we call other types of vices, which can be very harmful to the human soul. So in studying virtual ethics, we learn things we call virtue, like, for instance, practical wisdom is a virtue, prudence is a virtue, justice is a virtue, courage is a virtue. If anything, we call these the cardinal virtues, or the four of the four cardinal virtues, meaning that all other virtues fundamentally, at least according to those who accept this theory, all other virtues originate from these four. Now, in the Catholic tradition, they add to these virtues what we call the theological virtues. Now, so a virtue can be an intellectual virtue, it can be a moral virtue, it can be a theological virtue. So theological virtues, they say there are three others, the virtues of faith, of hope, and love. And so what they mean by these being theological virtues is because these are virtues that are actually directed towards God. Right. So in addition to these four, then you have these other three. So the four are courage, prudence, temperance, and justice. And then you add the other three, faith, hope, and love, which are directed towards God. And then you have what they call the cardinal virtues.